Isabella Blow's life was a tragedy from the start. She may have grown up to be an enigma of fashion, beauty, and art, making London Fashion Week popular, bringing fame to Alexander McQueen, Jeremy Scott, Stella Tennant, Sophie Dahl, Philip Treacy, and even more than that. But she was riddled with anxiety and depression throughout her life, which she herself linked to her childhood. Her life was as fabulous as it was tragic, and her story deserves to be told. This is the shorter version of a much longer story, which, and I cannot believe that I'm saying this, is now available in book form on Amazon. I've never done this before, so I'm wildly excited to share this with you. There's an e-version, a hardback, and a softback. So if you're wanting more of the story of Isabella, please go and buy a copy. I'll link it obviously below, and I'll do a pinned comment as well. So I'm really excited about this. I just hope you like it and give me lots of nice reviews. Also, the McQueen book is still coming. It's just taking a little bit more time than I expected, but the Isabella Blow book in that sense has been a wonderful learning experience for me, so please go and buy the book, click on the link, write me a nice review. Thanks so much, and I hope you enjoy the video. Isabella Delvers Broughton was born in 1958, and right from the start of her life, it was complicated. Thanks to a frivolous and murderous grandfather wasting the colossal family fortune away to only 10% of its value, Isabella was to grow up robbed of the life she once had been promised. Something unignorable to her as a child after the family was forced to move out of their massive stately home, Doddington Hall, into a much smaller 4-bedroom gardener's cottage on the estate called Doddington Park House. It was an impossible to miss visual daily reminder that Isabella was lesser. Unfortunately too, because the family dated back to the 14th century and was older than the formation of the United Kingdom, it also still ran on male primogeniture. So in that respect, Isabella was also forced to learn that anything that they did have, she, as a woman, could never inherit anyway. In 1961, Isabella was birthed a sister, Julia, and by 1962, the family finally received their long-awaited son, John Evelyn Delvers Broughton. But his birth was a short-lived relief. On September 12, 1964, at only 2 years old, John choked to death while in the care of Isabella. Of course, if you know the story of Isabella, you do know the accounts of her brother's cause of death vary, but none of which blame her for it. Some think he drowned, some think he choked. Many think Isabella embellished the story to the nth degree, including her own family. But actually, for the development of Isabella, it almost doesn't matter how he died, so much as the fact that he did while on her watch, and that at only 5 years old, she was now blaming herself for negligent manslaughter. Isabella's parents, Evelyn and Helen Delvers Broughton, did have a 4th child a few months after the death of John, which again they hoped for a boy, but it was another girl named Lavinia. This was crushing for the couple, and they stopped trying for an heir. However, while the couple did acquiesce that the family name was to end, Isabella's trajectory was never questioned. She was to continue to follow the traditional patriarchal routes by going to school solely to become happy and healthy, with absolutely no intention of ascending further in education. Regardless, it was in education, first at Nuthurst and then at Heathfield, both famously extremely prestigious schools, that Isabella's many defining character traits developed. Firstly, Isabella became really quite snobbish, looking down and even mocking her own mother for being from a bourgeois family. Second, she became extremely self-deprecating, most notably with her ugly appearance. Thirdly, Isabella became thoroughly interested in people of the opposite gender. And fourth, she became particularly intoxicated with the party life. That in their case was particularly raucous and sexualized. Something which, unfortunately, I am obliged to tell you, saw Isabella had at least 3 abortions while at Heathfield alone. Despite this, Isabella extremely loved boarding school. She felt respite here from her father and from his new wife Rona, who he had divorced Helen for in 1974, in a horrendously haunting goodbye. Quote, When Helen finally left Evelyn, she lined up her children on the gravel outside the gardener's cottage and shook their hands goodbye. This disgusting act of abandonment was the culmination of a truly dreadful mother-daughter relationship. But yet her relationship with Rona wasn't any better. Rona's arrival, in fact, made Isabella feel even more unwelcome in her childhood home after her 3 children moved in, meaning that the 4 current bedrooms were not enough, so the children now had to share rooms, and in turn it just increased the feeling of robbery that Isabella felt of Doddington Hall. Basically, Isabella felt unwelcome at home. Her stepmother tried to control her more than her father did. She was still in school but didn't have university coming as an option, and the usual process of going into the debutante circuit had been falling out of favor since the war, so that wasn't an option either. In the end, Isabella had no base, nothing to ground her or give her guidance for the future. She had no plan, no prospects, not even a home to go back to. She really felt like she had nothing, and so she turned to the only thing that helped give her stability: men. Isabella's first serious boyfriend was called Wolf, and they were bad for each other. Isabella was a lost child looking for guidance, and Wolf seemed to be on his own self-destructive path, stealing cars, siphoning petrol at midnight, and experimenting with hallucinogenic drugs, potentially including heroin. But Isabella fit in with the friendship group perfectly. She wasn't really a druggie, but her level of eccentricism was already a notable part of her personality. She told wild stories, egged herself on to be increasingly wild, and she loved nothing more than to perform stripteases to any and all that would watch. She may have hated her face, but she loved her body and loved to show it off. Really, this was her way of deflecting her now very ingrained insecurities about her visage. To quote her, "When you're poking the fire, it does not matter what is on the mantelpiece." Soon, Isabella became known in school for her promiscuity. As such, it's very likely Isabella and Wolf were just in an open relationship and that was completely normal within their social set. Even her father, Evelyn, knew of the guys she was juggling and approved of at least a couple, even while he was in hospital on a very serious matter. He had an infected varicose vein that was in the process of killing him. It affected Isabella horribly as she began juggling a lot of emotions around it. She grew fearful of losing her father, angry at her stepmother Rona for forbidding her to visit the hospital while he was sick, and she grew scared that if he was to die, she would end up going broke and homeless. And yet, instead of dealing with these emotions in therapy, and without the option of going home or to university, both of which would have offered some sort of stability, she ended up taking several different odd jobs to channel all of her many emotions around this time. Largely, these jobs are unnotable. They don't make a huge difference on her life, but there is just the one that is important to discuss, and that was just a shop job in Laura Ashley. But it wasn't important because of the job. Instead, it was important because it was only a 10-minute walk from her mother, Helen's flat on 17 Cadogan Square. So, while her father was seemingly dying, she had gone to live with her mother. However, within a short time of her arriving, her mother abandoned her there once again after she was called out of the country for reasons that are unexplained. It's very notable that in her actions for parental validation, for love and affection, she was repeatedly snubbed, either by replacement in her own bedroom, her stepmother's refusal to see her father in hospital, or from her mother's now second abandonment. Obviously, Isabella struggled with this, and despite a trip to Scotland to find some much-needed consoling from distant family, and despite her father regaining his health after a leg-ectomy, it did nothing to make her feel the security that she so desperately needed to find, and instead led to her moving in with Wolf. So now, looking for any form of stability, Isabella acquiesced to a 1-year secretarial course. Of course, this didn't solve any of her problems. She was still desperate for love and still totally unaware of how to find the unconditional love that she did so truly need. And in consequence, her actions just became more extreme. However, it took the mother of her friend Lucy to notice a deeper issue. Isabella had begun swinging from very, very high highs to very, very low lows, which you may be aware is an early sign of depression. Isabella began taking depression medication not too long after this, but an exact date is never specified. Soon, in 1976, Wolfe, after 2 years together, told Isabella that he no longer loved her. She was evicted from the home they shared in London, and she was left with no one to take care of her, and nowhere to go. It would trigger a third pathological fear in Isabella. First, she had her insecurities over money and inheritance. Then she grew diffidence in her appearance. And now she had a genuine pathological fear of homelessness. She regressed to the only coping method she knew: validation in the arms of men. She first dated a man named William Lee, who was a little unstable but not notable in her life. But then when they split in 1978, she met a man named Nick Taylor. Nick was considerate and sensitive, and he was well received by all of Isabella's friends. Soon, they together moved into the home of a new acquaintance, Zara Metcalf, who allowed them to live rent-free in her flat on the Little Boltons until he finished his course at Oxford. Here, Isabella finally had the stability that she lacked her entire life thus far. However, almost immediately after Nick graduated, he decided to try his hand at oil rigging in Midland, Texas, a totally unguaranteed vie for a quickly acquired vast amount of money. Isabella, very much in love, did decide to join him in the US, but instead of going to Texas, she went to New York, falsifying her A-level results to enroll in Columbia University, where she would study Chinese art and took illegal jobs to pay for it. And she kind of seemed to thrive. She was introduced to Andy Warhol and Jean-Michel Basquiat, and Isabella again became wildly popular in the party circuit for her stripteases. However, while on paper this was a formidable time in her life, the new environment also seemed to encourage her dichotomic expressions, leaving her with a more volatile experience of her own emotions. She found herself wildly up during parties or when she was working on a new creative project, only to uncontrollably crash with the fear of what would come next. In fact, it was perhaps for that reason that Isabella quit Columbia in 1980 to join Nick out in Midland, Texas, where they eloped on the 22nd of April, 1981. Within the year, Nick had given up on finding oil, having sunk a decent sum of money into it, and by 1983, with less prospects than ever, they decided to move back to New York, smartly using Isabella's legacy to purchase a 2-bedroom flat on the corner of Charles Street and West 4th in Greenwich Village. Finally, they had something that worked. Nick got into investing in bonds with the investment bank Solomon Brothers, and he was making decent money through it. Isabella met Anna Wintour and was subsequently hired as her assistant, a point we'll come back to, and because she was the only sibling that lived abroad, Evelyn could trust his illegal offshore £100,000 fund to Isabella as well. Really, the only negative about this whole second bout in New York was her next set of abortions, which may have totaled up to about 10 in this year alone, including her first miscarriage, something which has, in the years since, importantly been blamed on her Crohn's disease diagnosis from 1982. Which, in case you don't know, Crohn's disease is an inflammation of the intestines, which for Isabella saw her need to remove an 18-inch portion of her lower intestine and a blockage between her upper and lower intestines, which left her with a 7-inch scar across her midsection. This increased her pre-existing physical insecurities and would begin a whole new insecurity in her inability to produce an heir. This, however, was not actually dealt with, nor was it known at the time, and instead, for all intents and purposes, this was the healthiest she had ever been. She was pain-free following the surgery, she had a man that loved her, she finally had somewhere to ground herself, and she had a new job as the assistant to Anna Wintour, who had just been entitled Creative Director of American Vogue. But that didn't mean that Isabella fit in. Quote, in 1983, most of the designers making it big in America made nice clothes, but led sedate lives. American fashion at the time was dominated by really ambitious and hardworking professionals. Isabella, frankly, just approached fashion in a totally novel way for the Americans. To her, clothes were a form of art with which she could express emotion. Of course, by this point, it was not Anna's job to actually curate the fashion within the pages of the magazine, but Anna clearly understood the value of somebody that simply did it differently. In fact, she made such a notable impression on the magazine that many of the books on Isabella's life heavily suggest it was her influence that drew American Vogue out of its mundane, plain Jane safe style into embracing a few more exciting punts. Unfortunately, they don't give any explicit evidence for this, and it is true that every single book on Isabella's life does vary so much that it's hard to tell what is the honest truth, but it does seem at least true that Isabella did inspire those around her as Anna Wintour had expected, and that she brought American Vogue a talent that would soon make her famous, an incredible ability to scout the new and upcoming. But it wasn't her job. It actually wasn't what she was hired to do. She was influential and it was very much appreciated, but because Isabella didn't really have the organizational skills to do her actual role, she butted heads quite often with the other assistant and was soon moved to working for Andre Leon Talley instead, where her skills were more appreciated. This was the happiest time in her life. But just as she settled into this job that she finally loved, her relationship with Nick began to suffer. You see, Nick had left his job at the bank and was planning to live on his severance package for a total of 6 months. But this petrified Isabella, who was still having anxieties over poverty and of homelessness. Isabella had mainly flourished in New York because of the security that his lucrative job and their purchased home afforded her. It gave her the bandwidth to enjoy life to the fullest. But now that had been threatened, her anxieties quickly flooded back. Quote, "She needed money and lots of it, and only a rich man could provide that," said a friend. They weren't really fighting, but I remember Izzy saying, "Let's just get divorced. There's no point." Isabella, now divorced, rebounded quickly with a man named Colin Emlyn. The relationship didn't last long, but it was long enough for her to get through the remainder of the £100,000 left from the illegal international fund from her father. Isabella's spending had now become uncontrollable and was largely blamed on her depression. Not only had she spent through her father's £100,000 fund, but so much of her own money that she was now in debt to the extent that she was forced to sell her Charles Street address. And yet, now that the illegal money was spent, it did at least open her up to returning to the UK for a fortnight-long trip to Scotland. The only problem was that because she didn't inform her employer of her plans, her now boss, Andre Leon Talley, kindly called her to say that she cannot continue to be unreliable. She didn't take it well, there was a huge row, and she decided it was the right time to commit to returning to England. Anna threw her a going-away party, and though she was never explicitly fired, nor did she explicitly ever quit her job, it was just decided that their partnership was to come to an end. Isabella's dichotic behavior just continued to get more and more erratic, and Isabella found herself in a period of uncontrollable uncertainty. This primarily manifested in a growing need in Isabella to never be alone. So, though she could afford her own place, as her trust was still providing her £10,000 a year in 1986, which is the equivalent of about £30,000 today, she still couldn't live alone. She moved 4 times in 1986. In truth, though she seemed happy at this time, this was not the security that Isabella needed in her life. It's just, she needed this kind of moral support and had no one to actually ask for help. Meanwhile, her career too was not providing any stability either after she was hired for only a temporary position in the features department of Tatler magazine. However, unlike her living situation, at least her work life did eventually stabilize. You see, Tatler had been a bit of a sore spot in the Condé Nast portfolio for not being able to come close to the popularity it had once seen pre-war. Nowadays, the wealthy, continued to never like it for exposing their hedonistic ways, but the general public found it boring. Isabella was the perfect antidote. Throughout 1986, Isabella was endlessly tapped for her unbridled creativity by the magazine. So much so that most sources seem to kind of skip over her assistantship, which is how she was initially hired, and immediately pronounce that she became the style editor of the whole magazine. Something that really only happened at least a year later in either 1987 or 1988. But now, she was free to make more extravagant and controversial spread choices and to introduce new names onto the team, including previous husband Nick's new girlfriend, Isabella Blow, who she hired as a stylist. Selena and Isabella became quick friends. They had similar backgrounds, knew similar people, and had a similar sense of humor. However, Selena's inclusion in Isabella's life is most notable because it was she that would introduce Isabella to her next husband, Detmar Blow. Isabella met Detmar at the wedding of Emma Roper Curzon, where they bonded over their shared interest in fashion and a shared interest in the dark traumas of each other's lives. Isabella told Detmar the story of her brother's death, while Detmar detailed the method in which his father committed suicide, by drinking a bottle of paraquat bleach at their family estate. It wasn't really love at first sight, and it really didn't help that Isabella's friends did not approve of Detmar, but after a visit to their stately home in Gloucester, Isabella was sold. In fact, of the very few things the sources do 100% agree on, this is the most consensus-approved fact in Isabella's whole life, that Isabella adored Detmar's Gloucester family estate far more than she ever liked Detmar. 2 days after seeing the home, they agreed to marry. But to be fair, it was gorgeous. The stately home, which was called Hills, had been built by his architect father in 1913 and stood on 900 acres of land and did technically belong to Detmar's mother, Helga de Silva, who raised Detmar and his 3 siblings after their father's suicide. It was also in quite the state of disrepair after being largely abandoned by Helga in the mid-1980s when she went to live in Sri Lanka, where she was originally from, and it was only then intermittently cleaned by the cleaner when they could be bothered to do it. But it was still a grand home, visually not too dissimilar to Doddington Hall, in fact, the home that Isabella felt robbed of in her childhood, even if it was quite a bit smaller. Isabella now had a lot on her plate. She had a wedding to plan, a career going phenomenally well as she was credited with the repopularization of Tatler. She was discovering new fashion talents like never before, including the lingerie maker Rigby Impella, and patronizing new up-and-coming talent like Rifat Uzbek. But best of all, she now had a property to rebuild. Quote, "Her obsession was not fashion," said Philip Treacy. "It was with Hills." She poured all of her own money into Hills, so much that she actually needed to cut costs for her own wedding after her father's stinginess meant he only contributed £2,000 to the wedding himself, which is £6,300 today, just for reference. Regardless, in the end, she had a beautiful home to come home to, and she had a phenomenal wedding, which was held in Gloucester Cathedral. Detmar wore his grandfather's ambassador's jacket that he had worn when he met Isabella, and she ended up wearing a dark violet dress by young designer Nadia Laval with trompe-l'oeil embroidered necklace and 15-foot train. She also wore Milano Blahniks and, most famously, her very first Philip Treacy hat. It was the beginning of a very long friendship and even longer patronage of his work. By the end of the year, everything in her life was going well. She had a new husband, a new home that she loved just so much. Her work at Tatler was so famed that she was the talk of the town across the publishing industry. But the only problem is that it came with a huge financial cost. Her shoots regularly caused pushback from accounts, and she is still famed to this day for submitting the, according to Detmar's book, quote, highest expenses claim in the history of Condé Nast for a single item. It was the cost to buy a small ruin, and the magazine obviously refused payment for it. But then she was fired. It was just before Christmas in 1989, shortly after their honeymoon in fact, and Isabella was required to a meeting in Vogue House to discuss her rampant spending on photo shoots. It was at this meeting that she was fired from the magazine. She dried her tears, walked out of the office, and took the elevator up to the 5th floor of Vogue House to explain to Liz Telberis, the editor of British Vogue, who Isabella did not know, what had happened. The following day, handwritten on Tilberis's personalised photo cards, came a note that said, quote, "I can find a job for you at Vogue." Isabella was hired as a contributing editor, a promotion on the position that she had held just the previous day. She was an instant success at British Vogue, but she wasn't personally inspired by the magazine either. As far as fashion magazines go, it was one of, if not the, most commercially led and corporate publications there were, the total polar opposite from the much more scrappy Tatler. Instead, she found most of her excitement these days came from outside of work, where she would engage with small student designers like Philip Treacy. In fact, she walked for him in his graduate show in June 1990. She also housed the young milliner in her mother-in-law's home at Elizabeth Street, and according to Crow's biography of Isabella, in the same year she introduced him to Karl Lagerfeld at an American Vogue party, which led to him getting a job at Chanel within the week. This was her first major success at connecting protégés, a talent which would become her most defining. But only about a year and a half following this, she would find her biggest success story to date, Lee Alexander McQueen. The 1992 Central St. Martin's MA fashion show was packed. So packed, in fact, that when Isabella Blow arrived at the venue, there was nowhere for her to sit. Instead, she decided to sit on the stairs. Student after student showed their collection to the awe of guests, most watching primarily for the final student of the show, whose collection was chosen specifically by the head of the course, Louise Wilson, for being the most promising graduate student for the year. This year, she had chosen Kei Kagami. His collection was well liked at the time, but Isabella had focused her energy far more on another designer, Lee Alexander McQueen. And she was obsessed. Quote, "The pieces went past me and they moved in a way I had never seen, and I wanted them," she said later. The colours were very extreme. He would do a black coat, but then he'd line it with human hair, and it was blood red inside, so it was like a body, like the flesh with blood. And I just thought, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. I just knew he had something really special, very modern. It was about sabotage and tradition. Isabella was incessant in her desire to speak with him, calling his mother dozens of times a day until she got through and was eventually invited to Central St. Martin's to meet with the young designer, who did sell her his entire or almost his entire graduate collection for an unconfirmed sum of money. But make no mistake, he actually did not like Isabella when he first met her. He was quoted calling her mad, loony, and crazy, and treating the deal with an enormous amount of skepticism, purely going through with it to keep his head above water. But Isabella wouldn't let him out of her sight. First, McQueen was housed rent-free at 33 Alderney Street in Pimlico, a home owned by Isabella's mother-in-law. Secondly, in July 1992, McQueen was introduced to Philip Treacy, who he also did not get on with at first because of mutual jealousy for Isabella's attention. And then thirdly, in November 1992, McQueen was commissioned by Isabella to make a series of clothes for an upcoming British Vogue shoot at Hills, and provided McQueen, who, I'll remind you, had only just graduated 9 months prior, estimated media value running into the tens of thousands of pounds. However, alongside all of the wonderful opportunities that Isabella afforded him, the real treasure in this was the friends they found along the way. Isabella and McQueen grew inseparably close. She provided him with a smidgen more financial stability than he had before, promotion, access, and connections, while he provided Isabella a much-needed shoulder to lean on. They spent night after night together, sharing in their love of vulgar, their love of sex, their love of history, and their shared love of family lineage. especially because both of their families had proximity to untimely deaths. Isabella with her brother and father-in-law, and McQueen with his family links to Jack the Ripper, who killed his final victim in the home behind his ancestors, something I go over in the McQueen biography that I have on this channel. But even with a talent like Alexander McQueen's, she would continue her truffle hounding for new talent, patronizing those she loved best. The first of which, since the McQueen acquisition, being a series of petticoats by Reva Miva Segar, who, despite knowing McQueen at university, they were friends in fact, and despite also living with him rent-free in 33 Alderney Street, it catalyzed unbelievable jealousy in McQueen. He started displaying antisocial behaviors literally immediately, reading Miva Segar's Filofax, stealing and wearing his underwear, and even trying to stab Reva with a pair of dressmaking shears. Basically, McQueen was not the easiest person to be around in those days, but he was so talented that Isabella couldn't get enough. And soon, over time, McQueen did learn to yield to Isabella's need for the new, and his jealous rampages did at least somewhat calm. His relationships with her other protégés did improve, and they were slowly growing their chosen, much dysfunctional family, concomitantly insecure and vulnerable, and all in desperate need of unconditional kinship, which none really had the strength to give to one another. And unfortunately for them all, it would soon be Isabella who would need that unconditional support more than ever before. On the 5th of January 1993, Isabella was informed that her father had passed away from a congestive cardiac failure and chest infection. Her siblings, Lavinia and Rona, were there as he passed. Isabella, meanwhile, was with Detmar in Sri Lanka to visit her mother-in-law, but obviously rushed home to be with her family in time for the funeral on the 12th of January 1993. Upon return to England, naturally an important point of discussion was inheritance. However, while the three siblings were informed that Evelyn's estate now stood at £4 million, or about $8.5 million today, they were also informed that during his aforementioned varicose vein health scare, he had changed his will. He all but disinherited them, and they were only to receive a mere £5,000 each, about £10,000 today, quite significantly less than the $1.3 million they had all expected. It's thought that this was done to avoid paying tax, as there were none to be paid between husband and wife. However, in this case, because he did not detail his intentions for the estate after his wife Rona had also passed, it also seemed much more pointed, and it only stung further to learn that Rona was aware of the changes he had made. She said she asked him to inform them in the years between to mitigate any shock, but other than passing mentions, he didn't impress onto his children just how serious he was with his intentions. Naturally, the children were distraught. It was an insulting amount of money to inherit. They had, for one last and final time, been abandoned by their father. Isabella's fear of going broke intensified tremendously following this. Quote, Izzy's stability was washed away. Izzy had always, I think, quietly assumed that her father would leave her, if not a fortune, then enough money to comfortably get by on for the rest of her life. But £5,000? That's what her grandmother had left her housekeeper, and all the power was in Rona's hands. They could do nothing and they would get nothing. No paintings, no house in Cheshire, nothing. Evelyn had effectively disinherited his beloved daughters. It was an extraordinary betrayal from beyond the grave. Truly, the only positive to come from this was that it did not affect her editorial career, which actually by December 1993 was about to hit new heights after the informally named London Babes shoot, which was officially named Anglo-Saxon Attitudes, was commissioned by Vogue. It was championed as Stephen Meisel's first shoot for British Vogue, and though that's not entirely true, he had already shot a cover for British Vogue, in fact, back in December 1986, it was true that London Babes was his first solo shoot for British Vogue. As such, the shoot became really noteworthy in the publishing industry, and then truly famous after it was the catalyst to Stella Tennant's entire career. And yet, despite all of this, the shoot was also the catalyst to the end of Isabella's time at British Vogue. No reason was ever really given, but it seems as a result of this shoot that she was bumped to the contributing editors line in September 1994. In short, she was forced against her will to go freelance as a stylist. It was tough. Philip Treacy had major success at Chanel, Stella Tennant had huge success, even McQueen's success was beginning to pick up. But Isabella once again had nothing. Or, if not nothing, much less than she had previously, which naturally felt like a huge blow. So she turned to what she knew how to do best, talking up the designers and creatives whom she was excited about. But the truth is, what she really needed was to feel needed. You see, alongside her working career falling apart, her inheritance being short, Detmar and Isabella had been trying and failing to make a baby. Because of Isabella's Crohn's disease, she had long not been likely to bear a child. She obviously hid this from Detmar, who she allowed to take the initial blame, but internally, she blamed herself and began to berate herself for the abortions which she now so deeply regretted. They spent 1994 through 1996 trying IVF treatment after IVF treatment after IVF treatment, spending a large chunk of their income finances on the procedures and even needing to increase their overdraft to afford it. Slowly but surely, the cost and the uncertainty began to take a massive toll on Isabella's mental health. In the end, it took until 1996 for Isabella to give up. Detmar recalls how she had a contraceptive coil embedded, and he knew that that signaled the end of Isabella's willingness to try. Her focus returned to her muses. She discovered two models, Iris Palmer and Annabelle Rothschild, both of whom walked in the McQueen Autumn/Winter 96 show, and by March, things were finally starting to look back up in her own career thanks to an Amy Spindler article about Isabella and her muses published in the New York Times, named In London, Blue Blood Meets Hot Blood. In fact, the article was the beginning of an Isabella Blow renaissance back to influence, culminating in a 3-page profile of her in the September issue of American Vogue in interview with Hamish Bowles. Isabella was back, and her influence could not have been felt more. And yet, it was about to be even more unignorable after McQueen was offered the creative director position at Givenchy. Isabella was thrilled and saw this as her long-awaited recompense for her patronage. She would be his official muse, paid for her influence. But when the time came, he said their relationship wasn't about money and did not include her in the deal. Quote, "She gave Lee everything," says Julie MacDonald, "all her money or her time or her energy. She introduced him to everybody. And then, when he went to Givenchy and he had money, he told her to piss off. He had millions, she was penniless, and he gave her nothing. He just shut the door." It was cruel, but it was also confusing. There really wasn't a good reason for not including Isabella in the deal, especially as he chose his team personally, with none contested by LVMH, who was the parent company to Givenchy. Isabella and a few others believed that it was because he had replaced her as a stylist with Katie England and as a muse with Annabelle Rothschild, who Isabella had introduced him to, but the prevailing theory is just that she annoyed him in the moments leading up to the contract signing. Nevertheless, and unfortunately, McQueen was now very powerful. So, if Isabella wanted to keep at the top of fashion, she had to grit her teeth and smile like nothing was wrong. A few months after that, the Cool Britannia picture they had taken previously with Lorenzo Aghias for Vanity Fair was published. Isabella holding the train of McQueen. It was the perfect metaphor for how their relationship had changed. For so long, she had a family-derived fear of abandonment, and now her chosen family had done just the same. So, much like usual, when scorned, Isabella turned to discovering new talent, and within weeks of her McQueen snub, she had already found it. Post-announcement, but pre-Givenchy debut, Isabella discovered a 14-year-old Sophie Dahl, the granddaughter of the prolific children's book author Roald Dahl. Sophie was an immediate and huge success right at the time Isabella needed it most. McQueen debuted at Givenchy almost exactly at the same time, and it was the kick Isabella really needed to negate any self-pity that may have come from it. But interestingly and importantly, it seemed that Isabella had learnt her lesson of free promotion. Dahl became the first muse of Isabella's who had it written into their contract that Isabella was to be paid a commissionary finder's fee. Isabella was back on top. But it came at a cost. She began abusing her depression medication and had begun to talk flippantly about her own death. Much like everything in Isabella's life, when it rained, it poured. So, in 1997, simultaneously to McQueen's Givenchy debut in January, Dahl's discovery in February, and the Vanity Fair shoot Cool Britannia being published in March, Isabella was scouted by old co-worker Jeremy Langmead, who was an intern while she was working at Vogue, for a position he had opening up at the Sunday Times. He needed someone to breathe life into the Sunday Times style guide. By her first day alone, Langmead knew he had struck gold. Her first shoot, which was published on the 27th of July 1997, was of Honor Fraser shot by Mario Testino, who, because he liked Isabella, worked free of charge. And it was a sensation, instantly changing the reputation of the paper, importantly democratizing the access to good fashion for the wider public, and quickly turning the Sunday Times style guide into one of the most buzzworthy publications of the time. Her work, once again, became her home away from home, right as she needed it most. You see, Helga had sold the Elizabeth Street address to pay for her newest divorce. It forced the couple to reassess their current living situation, which was at Detmar's uncle's Chelsea Street home, and resulted in them buying a small cottage on 5 Theed Street in Waterloo, which they completed on the 7th of April 1997. It again desperately needed renovation, costing them 2 years and £85,000, which is the equivalent today of £165,000, and was more than double Isabella's £40,000 yearly salary. But there was another unignorable problem. It was simply too far from her friends on either side of the city. She had unwittingly placed herself in a physical limbo that was metaphorical between her two worlds. Her wealthy friends in the west side of London and her artistic friends in the east. Nevertheless, the home was still predominantly used as a touchpoint for the weekdays, while herself and her entire posse often continued to decamp to Hills for the weekend, including the weekend of the 3rd of May 1997, in which the BBC arrived to film Alexander McQueen cutting up rough. It was directly on this weekend that he famously was significantly crueler to them both, mocking Detmar and Isabella's inability to have children, mocking their lack of funds, and mocking his ability to exploit his power over them both. Quote, "It was particularly unfair to Izzy, because she had only ever encouraged and helped Alexander, yet he now appeared to want to lord it over her and reveled in that. But Alexander was right. He was in the driving seat now. But she couldn't let him go. He was the most talented person she had ever known, and she was desperate for him to love her back." Outwardly, everything in Isabella's life was exceptional. She had her dream job, the highest readership in English fashion, she was championed as the seminal force behind London Fashion Week, and she was the star front row guest at every fashion show in London and Paris, including couture. She loved her job, but unfortunately her job did not love her back. Before long, Isabella started to hate going to Fashion Week season because the expectation for her to be Isabella Blow was too intense. Her depression grew uncontrollably, and yet no one could tell because she had functioned so successfully under a depressive thumb for so long. while her effervescent nature provided the perfect disguise. By that Christmas in 1997, it was clear to Detmar that she was in desperate need of help. But she didn't get any. Instead, she dove deeper into work. With Hills, with a new contract at Liberties, they opened an art gallery called Modern Art, and she started promoting Jeremy Scott. Jeremy Scott was already niche famous, so it's not really fair to say that she discovered him, but in order for his business to move to the next step, Jeremy really needed the ability to sell his goods in France, something which he could not do without a European partner. Obviously, with the Blows being European, it was only natural that they would step in. Detmar became the managing director of the company, and they decided to use the French office of Detmar's law firm to register the company in Europe. Simultaneously, in fact, within only weeks of the gallery making its first sale on the 3rd of June 1998, Isabella then furthered her own career by signing a 1-year contract for an advisory role to consult Swarovski & Co. on how to turn around their rather dated image. In fairness, Isabella was a risk for Swarovski, but their bet paid off really quickly. Isabella soon proved completely pivotal to changing the way Swarovski was experienced by the public after she introduced them as a sponsor to various designers, including the Jeremy Scott's Autumn-Winter 98 collection, the first one that she worked on with him, and simply just connecting Swarovski to the different people who could make their brand seem desirable. But as good as she was for Swarovski, the Swarovski family were equally good to Isabella. They began by helping her set up an apartment at 1 Rue Tiron in Paris, for which they shared the rent with the Sunday Times, making it easier for her to travel back and forth from London for fashion weeks. Secondly, the contract did not have an exclusivity clause, so she was able to remain at her job at the Sunday Times, as well as continuing to do other freelance work. And thirdly, on top of that, they paid her rather handsomely. She got £40,000 per year, or just shy of £80,000 today. It quite literally doubled her annual income, meaning they finally had money. But she still felt that she had been betrayed by her best discovery. Isabella and Lee Alexander McQueen were no longer close friends by this time in 1998. They were still intrinsically linked and allegedly were still supposedly spending boozy nights together at Hills. But the relationship between them had soured to a point of no return. For Isabella, this became an incredibly sore topic, and unfortunately, her displeasure was starting to bleed out to her other discoveries as well. She was famously careless with the items that she borrowed, either ruining them or losing them often, and because she would complain on top of that about her various life problems, they simply felt disinclined to share with her. Her mania obviously wasn't her fault, but the consequences of her ever-increasing frenzy were unavoidably real for those around her. A situation that would further worsen after, and this story is contested, she helped McQueen out of his LVMH Givenchy deal by catalyzing the sale of his namesake business to the Gucci group. This story is far too long to go into in this video, but I do obviously go into it in more detail in these videos. It was the beginning of another very dark time in Isabella Blow's life. The houses on the estate were only sporadically rented, the art gallery was no longer doing its best financial seasons, and on top of that, her marriage was falling apart. In fact, by 2001, life at Hills was continuing nearly completely without Detmar. He was largely not around for the social gatherings, but regardless, stories of the wilder nights were finding their way back to the property's legal owner in Sri Lanka, Detmar's mother, Helga de Silva Blow Pereira. This was a problem. You see, Helga, having recently visited, was very taken with the work that Isabella had done with the home, restoring it with her own money in ways that Helga had never bothered to do. So, now with stories of the many parties at Hills, Helga seemed to want to use this as an excuse to remove Isabella from the home, taking it for herself by way of giving it to Detmar's sister Selina. In Helga's eyes, she was the more reliable one as an heir because she was already married to a doctor and had 2 children. The news obviously sent Isabella into a depressive state. Instead of fighting for the home she'd spent vast amounts of money diligently restoring, she just kind of gave up on fighting for it, instead acquiescing to a much smaller home on the estate known as Spoon Bed Farm. Though it is important to note that despite this becoming the new intended plan, for the while they continued to live in Hills regardless. By which I mean Isabella mostly lived in Paris through this time, and I believe Detmar was housed at their home on Thede Street, but they did continue to host frequent parties in Hills, spending weekends there as well, despite all of the warnings. However, right on the cusp of divorce, in September 2001, Isabella would find herself needing his support more than ever after she was abruptly fired from the Sunday Times. She flooded back into her vicious manic depressive cycle that made her hyper aware of the various dejections that she had had recently. She was not doing well. Her career was shot, her personal life was in shambles, she would go weeks without speaking to Detmar, and soon, so too, her only financial investment in a fashion company. Quote, "In early 2002, Izzy called me in a state of high anxiety from Paris. Some French bailiffs had turned up at Rue Tiron to take an inventory. Jeremy Scott had a creditor who had a judgment against his company for 2 million francs, about £200,000. I, as the manager of his company, was responsible. The company address was registered at our flat. They were going to seize our things. Isabella was in a very vulnerable position, and almost everything in her life was unsure. And yet, despite all of this, she soon signed a new £100,000 deal with DuPont, a cool $40,000 more than her contract with the Sunday Times, continued her work with Swarovski to much praise. Jeremy Scott managed to solve the financial issues within the company, and she was commissioned to produce a new exhibition for the Design Museum called When Philip Met Isabella, which was a massive hit. However, when the extra work that came specifically with the exhibition came to a close, its effects were almost immediately resulting in Isabella's mania significantly worsening. Something then bolstered when Detmar's sister and family finally moved into Hills that summer. Isabella received a written notice to vacate the property in 12 months that October. She was crushed. The eviction not only removed Isabella from her beloved home and project, but it served as a stark reminder that Isabella, by this point, could likely never produce a child. Her inability to bear a child became a cornerstone of her manic depressive episodes. Her failed friendships, the dejection of her own family, her personal appearance, the rejection of Helga, her failing marriage, and her ability to produce an heir to both her own family's name and to Detmar's formed a concoction of self-loathing from which she would never recover. By that December, her marriage was over. January 2003, Detmar filed for divorce. Isabella left for a series of holidays, and by the time she returned to cover the Couture Fashion Week show for her new job at Tatler, Detmar had already moved out and got a flat for himself in Shoreditch. Isabella was no longer well functioning through her mania. By either January or June 2003, depending on the source, Isabella was taken to a mental health hospital by the name of The Priory by Lee Alexander McQueen, who paid for the treatment. However, because McQueen believed Detmar was directly to blame for Isabella's mental health decline, he did this on the condition that she not have contact with Detmar ever again. She obliged. However, it was likely because of this condition that she would soon reintroduce herself to a man that would become a notable drain on her life. During her stint at the Priory, she took a trip to Venice where she would start an affair with a Venetian who she had met the previous October. Many of her friends believed he was only really in it for the money. She would shower the man with money and gifts unlike anyone she had before. In fact, she was so generous with her new lover that it raised governmental suspicions and saw Inland Revenue come to Hills to run an audit of her accounts. She didn't show up for the meeting, but it still concluded that she owed a significant amount in tax. By June, her mania was unconcealable. Casanova was unfaithful. She cut the relationship off. 3 months later, she was discharged from the Priory in September 2003, put on a new course of treatment, including antidepressants and lithium, but was still, admittedly, very, very far from well. Isabella still needed stability. She didn't have it in Detmar, she didn't have it in Casanova, and she didn't have it from McQueen, who in fairness was not in a good position himself to provide it. As such, almost immediately after discharge, she had dinner with Detmar, he spent the night, and it did not, nor could it, save the relationship. By November 2003, Isabella had already reconciled with Casanova in Venice. Her mania continued to worsen. She became childlike and timid. She had no money to go through with the divorce proceedings. Her money continued to go to Casanova. He spent it lavishly on Theed Street. He became abusive. She began experiencing shaking. By 2004, Isabella was at a point of no return. She could work well enough because her creativity was fed beautifully by her manic bouts of productivity, enough to produce everything that all of her clients, DuPont, Swarovski, Tatler, could need. But her personal life, she just didn't have the bandwidth to continue with. It's seemingly this that had kept Casanova from being disregarded. He provided her solace from depression. But the relationship was not healthy whatsoever, and fortunately for her, this was soon to end. Quote, although her friends had tried to intervene several times, it was Casanova who finally made the break with Isabella. Fed up with the stories she was telling about him, he began to ignore her phone calls. For the first time in 15 years, Isabella was officially without a man in her life. For any woman of 46 to suddenly find herself single would have been a major adjustment. With Isabella's need for attention and craving for security, it would have been completely crippling. It didn't take Isabella long to find a new romantic obsession, as by Valentine's Day 2004, she had met a descendant of the Mellon Bank fortune, Matthew Mellon, who she fell for due to their shared interest in footwear. They broke up not long after, but Mellon would actually go on to be a lifelong friend, and more importantly, it was he who aided her pivotal reconciliation with Detmar. Pivotal because it was the notable final straw for McQueen. McQueen had made his distaste for Detmar very clear when he paid for her mental health treatment before. To him, he could not support a woman who was not willing to help herself. So, now supposedly also aware of the electroshock therapy, which he so vehemently disapproved of as well, he cut Isabella out of his life completely. Or at least that's what he said he would do, but only actually cut her out of his life for about the next couple of months. In which time, stability was the thing Isabella needed the most. And at least in Detmar, this is what she found. It certainly helped to mitigate the fallout of her Swarovski contract coming to its natural end, and helped mitigate the increased pressure to pay back their debt, which had now reached £1 million, which today is about 1.8 million. But that also didn't mean that she was particularly kind to Detmar either, nor did it mean her reckless spending would find any sense of calm. Truthfully, she just needed to stop working in order to heal. But she couldn't. Isabella was so well defined by her job that it was impossible for her to drop working completely. Instead, she decided to self-medicate by going out to parties and getting drunk to try to forget the stress and the burnout, which, considering alcohol as a depressant, certainly did not help her in the slightest. They sold their Theed Street property for a decent profit that September, replacing the investment with a ground floor flat on 25 Eaton Square. However, Isabella just did not and really could not improve throughout this and the next year. Her behavior was now inexplicably difficult to deal with. The people she worked with were becoming exasperated with her inability to function and with her desperate need for telling anyone and everyone around her that she wanted to unalive herself, including colleagues that were not her friends but were hired by Condé Nast solely to keep her safe and alive while her fame and connections could provide what the company needed from her. By that November, not too long after the release of her MAC Cosmetics collaboration lipstick, She abruptly stopped seeing Dr. Wolfson and pulled out of all therapy entirely. She had given up. Isabella wanted to die. She told anybody that would listen that she wanted to die. Anna Wintour convinced Condé Nast to pay for a 6-week recovery course that was recommended by a friend, but it wasn't designed for depression. She was discharged only 3 weeks into the program, and instead, Isabella was taken to other better-suited facilities. But again, she saw no success and began a series of serious self-unaliving attempts, beginning on the 20th of March 2006. It was at this time that she overdosed on pills. In fact, if it wasn't for Philip Treacy and his partner Stefan Bartlett spontaneously dropping by, this would have killed her. Instead, they called an ambulance and she woke up the next day in St. Thomas's Hospital. She was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and was sectioned under the Mental Health Act. In April, she overdosed again. Later that same month, she drove her car into the back of a Tesco's lorry, and in June, in her most serious attempt to date, she threw herself off of an elevated section of the A4 in Ealing. Unfortunately, by this point, the generosity of Condé Nast was wearing thin. They had exhausted their insurance, their corporate Medicare, and they had willingly given further company funds beyond this for the recovery of Isabella. So, they decided to admit her to an NHS hospital known as Gordon Hospital in Victoria, London. It was free, and it was long-term. But by all accounts, this seemed to have been quite a tragic move. Friends say that it was more like a prison than it was like a hospital, and in essence, they claimed she was unsafe here. Soon, Isabella began to chant, "I want to die, I want to die, I want to die," endlessly to herself. By the 29th of June, she was moved to a private hospital in North London named Capio Nightingale, thanks to Daphne Guinness and Alexander McQueen, who secretly offered to pay. But it did nothing to change her opinion on her fate. When her discharge came in August, she had a manic bout of productivity, which was quickly followed by a trip to Goa in December, where she took a dose of sedatives and tried to drown herself in the sea. She obviously survived and continued to work. In February 2007, after a minor work snub, she again overdosed in Kuwait, and while in treatment for this overdose, the doctors discovered a potentially cancerous ovarian cyst. In March, she was found planning to leap in front of a train in Croydon, which in response for, she was moved from London to Hills, where there were no trains, but this in itself was a precursor to one of her most hauntingly final weekends. You see, in April 2007, Alexander McQueen would visit Hills just for the weekend. However, when he arrived, McQueen refused to do anything Isabella had planned and instead spent the entire time in his bedroom. It was the final breaking point to their relationship, and a weekend that would soon come to haunt McQueen for the remainder of his life after he found out it was because of this weekend that she changed her will to remove him entirely. After this weekend, Isabella perked up. She went to have her ovarian cyst removed, she was charismatic again, she went back to work on photo shoots, she announced the launch of a line of accessories, she even quite placidly decided on a course of chemotherapy to control the cancer which had been confirmed was the cause of her ovarian cyst, and she began to plan a large party at Hills on April the 28th, 2007. She did have one more suicide attempt in this time, when the day after she was confirmed to have had cancer, she tried to jump out of a moving car. But in comparison to how she was before, in none of this time she seemed outwardly negative, so to her friends seemed to have made a remarkable improvement. But little did they know that her April 28th party was going to be her goodbye party. On the 5th of May 2007, she walked into the garden with a bottle of paraquat weed killer and swallowed the liquid down. Her sister Lavinia found her and called an ambulance, but it was too late. Isabella was given days to live. She lasted only one. Quote, "When I went into Izzy's room, she had deteriorated substantially, and I suddenly wished I had bought more flowers. Many more. All the flowers in the world. a whole room full of them. She was fighting for breath, and it was plain to see that she was dying. I sat with her. It was very peaceful, almost odd that for once there was no drama, no telephones ringing. We were together and there was nobody else. Then Izzy said she wanted to go to sleep, and I said, "Well, you go on." Largely the media blamed the speed of fashion for her demise. McQueen blamed himself. It was an unshakable feeling that he was unable to hide during her funeral in Gloucester Cathedral later that month. Philip Treacy chose her outfit, a red silk brocade coat embroidered with gold with matching shoes, and he famously put her in the ship hat that she loved so much. While for her cremation, she wore a pale green Alexander McQueen kimono and Philip Treacy pheasant feather hat. McQueen took a lock of her hair to be made into a ring for himself to emulate the Victorian tradition they both admired. Her sisters inherited Isabella's Eaton Square flat, which they sold for £535,000, and they gave the profits to Detmar, who had just had a new child with a different woman. Isabella's wardrobe was also inherited by her sisters, who were unfortunately forced to sell it to wipe her remaining £88,000 in debt, though Daphne Guinness eventually stepped forward to buy the collection in its entirety to keep the soul of Isabella together. She told the Financial Times she just couldn't bear to see Isabella's legacy plundered. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please do like and subscribe. If you'd like to see the Alexander McQueen biography that I have, it's linked here. I do also have a couple of biographies on my beauty channel, which I will link here as well. And a special thank you goes out to my patrons over on Patreon, some of whose names are on the screen now. All content used in this video is done so in accordance with the principles of fair use. However, if you have any concerns, please contact me directly at contact@understitch.co.uk.